Welcome to Your Soul Rising. In this video, I lecture through Book 1 of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. I've optimized some audio settings, so hopefully my voice is clearer than in the introduction video, and hopefully you can hear the fireplace crackling in the background. So take a moment, get cozy, grab a copy of the book if you have one, get a hot drink, whatever will make your soul ready to rise. And now, let's get started. Book 1 opens as Boethius sits in the shadows of a prison cell, silent but restless. His face, once composed with the dignity of a Roman statesman, now wears the marks of sleepless nights and spiritual collapse. His hair is disheveled, his robes hang loosely on his frame, and his fingers tremble as they hold a stylus, scribbling verses not of philosophy, but of grief. The man who once governed with justice, who interpreted Plato for his time, who believed in the harmony of reason and power, is now a captive, cast into disgrace by treachery and injustice. He has lost not only his freedom, but his faith in the world's order. He doesn't just suffer, he mourns a much deeper loss, the collapse of meaning, the collapse of his entire previous identity. Poetry pours from him in anguished meter. It tries to soothe the ache of betrayal. His words weep of fortune and misfortune, the cruel goddess, once generous, now capricious. He had trusted her smile and now feels the full weight of her disdain. As Boethius lowers his stylus and gazes emptily at the cold stone beneath him, the air in the room shifts. A presence enters, not through a door or a dream, but through an inward summoning from the soul. A woman of immense stature and otherworldly bearing fills the space, radiating gravity and calm. Her eyes shine with depth beyond time, and though her appearance is regal, her robe is worn, torn, and embroidered with the faded Greek letters pi and theta, the emblems of action and contemplation. Her clothing is not faded by age, but by abandonment, as if the world has ceased to heed her. She carries books and a scepter, but her expression is filled with pain, not just for herself and her abused condition, but for him. She looks down at Boethius with a gaze that pierces illusion. This is philosophy, personified as maternal, severe, and redemptive. She does not speak at once. She surveys the room, notices the presence of the muses of poetry, who have been whispering into Boethius's ear, feeding his grief with rhythm and sorrow. Her brow furrows. "Who allowed these theatrical whores near my patient?" she demands. The muses shrink away, scolded by the clarity of truth. Philosophy is not here for embellishment. She is not here to console with pretty lies. She is here to heal, and her first act is to drive away the illusions that prolong the sickness. Boethius is startled by her voice, by her presence, by the memories she awakens in him. He squints through his despair, barely able to recognize the woman who had once guided his soul. He remembers her vaguely, like a song half forgotten, like a teacher whose lessons once shaped his mind, but have long gone unused. Philosophy approaches him with both pity and reprimand. She asks, "Are you not the man who once drank deeply of my well, who learned the structure of the cosmos, the unity of the good, the harmony of divine reason? And now, look at you. You weep like a child abandoned by his nurse. What happened to your strength?" Boethius tries to speak. His voice is cracked, his words tangled in the vines of grief. He explains that fortune has turned against him, that the wicked thrive while the just perish, that the state he served with honor now treats him as an enemy, that he did nothing wrong. He reminds philosophy of his good deeds, how he defended the poor, how he spoke for the voiceless, how he upheld the law against tyrants. And yet here he is, in chains, abandoned by friends, betrayed by those in power. His entire life now appears to him a cruel joke. Philosophy listens, but does not interrupt. She lets his sorrow spill until it empties itself. Then she speaks again, calm but piercing. You are sick, she says, not in body, but in soul. You have forgotten what you are. You remember your outer life, but have lost the inner vision that gave it meaning. The reason you suffer so deeply is not that fortune has turned on you, but that you trusted her in the first place. Boethius blinks, confused. What do you mean? Should I not expect that good deeds bring good reward? That virtue should protect me from ruin? No, she answers simply. Not if you understand the nature of fortune. She begins with diagnosis. Boethius' soul, she says, is like a man who has lost his memory. He grieves because he thinks something essential has been taken from him, but in truth, he has only lost the illusion of stability. Fortune, by her very essence, is changeable. That is her nature. She gives and takes without reason. To be surprised when she turns is to confess that one never understood her to begin with. You trusted the gifts of fortune, philosophy tells him, but did you forget they were never really yours? Boethius begins to protest, to argue that he has been uniquely wronged, but philosophy reminds him that his story is not rare. Have you forgotten the countless others who have suffered the same, she asks. Have you forgotten Socrates, condemned by his own city? Have you forgotten Seneca, forced to die by the emperor he once served? What arrogance to think your suffering is unusual. Her voice is not mocking, but honest, her intention not to belittle, but to awaken him to the long pattern of history. Good men fall, evil men rise. If this troubles you, then perhaps your understanding of justice needs correction. Still, Boethius insists on the cruelty of it. He speaks of his youth, of his marriage, of his children. Gifts of fortune, now shaded by sorrow. He speaks of his honors, once so meaningful, now exposed as empty tokens. He speaks of the betrayal by the court, of false charges, of silence where there should have been outcry. Philosophy does not contradict these facts. She accepts them, but insists that they must be reframed. The pain is real, but the meaning he gives to the pain is his own doing. If he can step back from the surface, he might remember the deeper truths that he once held. She then asks him to remember who he is, not just Boethius the Roman, but Boethius the soul, the seeker, the student of eternal things. She speaks of the body as a prison, but more dangerously, of opinion as a prison more confining than chains. You are not what fortune gives you, she reminds him. You are not your office, not your property, not your reputation. You are something else entirely, something no one can steal. Boethius falls silent. Her words reach him, though faintly. The fire of intellect, long smothered, begins to flicker again. He feels the stirrings of memory, not of simple external facts, but of inward understanding. He had once believed in an ordered universe. He had once believed that all things moved according to reason, that God was not absent, but immanent, present even in suffering, despite being transcendent. Where had that belief gone? Philosophy continues, pressing gently. She says that grief, though understandable, often disguises pride. When we suffer, we believe we have been robbed of what we deserved. But what do we deserve? If we base our happiness on external things, then we grant fortune dominion over our lives. You worshipped a false goddess, philosophy says, and now that she has cast you down, you call it injustice, but you should have known her nature. She paints a vivid picture of fortune's wheel, that ancient symbol of rise and fall. Kings rise to the top, only to be flung down. Beggars ascend with the same arbitrary twist. Would you stop the wheel from turning, she asks? Then it would not be fortune at all. Her nature is change. To trust her is to be like a sailor. who believes the sea owes him calm. The wise man, she says, does not curse the storm. He builds a ship that can survive it. Boethius listens, beginning to see, though his heart is still bruised. He asks, if all things are changeable, what then can we trust? What foundation remains? Philosophy replies, that is the question. That is where we begin. But not with logic yet. First, we must restore your soul. First, you must remember who you are. She begins a kind of gentle unbinding, not yet arguing for the full structure of reality, but undoing the lies he has believed. She reminds him of the fickleness of fame, the emptiness of power, the illusion of control. She reminds him that many who possess external goods are miserable, and many who lack them are free. Would you call a man rich if he owns gold, but is afraid to sleep for fear of thieves? Would you call a man powerful if he rules others, but cannot rule himself? These are not just rhetorical flourishes. They are the beginning of his healing. Philosophy is like a physician who must first clean the wound before she can sew it. Boethius is still broken, but he is beginning to question the terms of his despair. He begins to suspect that perhaps the greatest betrayal was not by others, but by himself, by the part of him that forgot the truth when his world collapsed. She praises his past strength, his past clarity. You are not a beginner, she tells him. You have studied the great traditions. You know the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. You know that the highest good cannot be taken away, that true happiness is found not in things, but in the harmony of the soul with reason. You know this, and yet you forgot. So let's return to it. As the dialogue continues, philosophy begins to sing, not in the literal sense, but in poetic verse. Throughout Book 1, prose and poetry alternate like breath, inhale and exhale. In the poems, philosophy mourns the fallen state of reason in the world, decries the ascendancy of vice, and calls for the restoration of divine order. Her verses are not ornamental. They are incantations meant to stir remembrance, to awaken what has been dormant in Boethius's heart. The poetry provides music to the mind's recovery, harmonizing emotion with intellect. And yet, she does not promise a reversal of his fate. She does not promise that Boethius will be released, or that the world will reward the good. That is not her task. Her promise is different, that even in the darkest prison, the soul can be free. That even amid injustice, one can find peace, not by changing the world, but by aligning oneself with what is external, stable, and just. No external fate, she implies, can imprison a mind that sees truly. Book 1 ends with a quiet turning. Boethius, still a prisoner, still condemned, begins to rise, not in body, but in thought, and ultimately in soul. The woman of philosophy has come to remind him that his soul, though battered, is not broken and can never be broken, that he is not the sum of what has been taken from him, that the light he seeks has never left him, only been obscured. And so, under the flickering torch of memory, the two prepare to descend together into his despair, and then into the depths of wisdom, where even the wheel of fortune cannot reach. All right, so that's the summary of Book 1. Now we'll go through some of the important passages that I pulled out and highlight some of the deeper meanings behind the narrative. First, the very opening line of Book 1, Chapter 1. I, who once wrote songs with joyful zeal, am driven to grief to enter weeping mode. In this opening, we see Boethius endure a loss of meaning in his egoic identity. In other words, his dark night of the soul. He has lost his status, his money, his reputation, his identity, his nationhood, both personally and collectively with the fall of the Roman Empire. He has seen a breakdown in justice and a breakdown of the simple duality of right and wrong that he once trusted. Now note that there are two things that are getting in the way of his soul's ascension here. They make up the egoic personality and identity, and they are external sources of validation, such as his former fortune, his political power and reputation, his identity with Rome and the prestige and glory associated with it, and then also his limiting beliefs that are internal but obscuring the true nature of the soul. And these limiting beliefs are closely tied to those external objects of validation. The result, as echoed by many of the spiritual traditions around the world, is that the soul forgets its true nature by identifying as its limiting beliefs, as its physical body, and as the trappings of physical life. It loses its identity as the subject, instead focusing on the objects of its experience, whether they be material or mental. And we see in Lady Philosophy's description how these limiting beliefs and how this egoic worldview get maintained, particularly by those who are using their intellect to justify their continued belief in it. For instance, her dress is noble, but it has been torn. It's been abused. There are scraps that have been taken from it, symbolizing the fact that we all take scraps of the truth, but we don't have the whole unity of the truth. It's a commentary that there are many worldviews and sectarian positions that have pieces of the truth, but still largely remain in ignorance, and it becomes very easy for us to attach our emotions and our egoic personality to identifying with these worldviews that contain partial truth. There's a line here that her clothing's splendor was obscured by a kind of film, as of long neglect, like statues covered in dust. Many of the ideas that we adopt that are only partial truths are from misunderstanding ancient or older knowledge and systems. Of course, Boethius himself dedicated his life's work to restoring those ancient systems and the ancient knowledge, bringing back especially the Greek tradition that underlied Roman intellectual culture. Then we see the muses. They're not bad, muses aren't, because Lady Philosophy says that she has her own. But the ones that are tending to Boethius before she arrives are enticing. They draw him further into egoic negative reactions and into duality. They provide entertainment, but not healing. They only increase his immersion into the illusion of his false identity. And it is these that Lady Philosophy sends away, so that she can begin to treat him with reason and truth. Then, as we start chapter 2, we really see, again, the idea of the material illusions and the illusory material identity in the lines, "So sinks the mind in deep despair, and sight grows dim when storms of life inflate the weight of earthly care. The mind forgets its inward light." We see this idea of inward light, again, in many spiritual traditions across the world. We see it, for instance, in Christian Quakerism. We see it in Gnosticism, the sparks of the divine. We see it, of course, in Platonism and also in Hermeticism. The idea that the soul is a spark of God that descends into the material illusion, undergoes a kind of amnesia brought about by separation from the fullness of the divine, and then spends its life or lives, depending on if the system in question has multiple lives and incarnations, trying to remember its true nature, to learn the lessons of the material realm of duality, and then eventually return to the unity of God. The passage goes on, "This was the man who once was free, to climb the sky with zeal devout, to contemplate the crimson sun, to frozen fairness of the moon. Astronomer once used in joy, to comprehend and to commune with planets on their wandering ways. This man sought out the source of storms that roar and rouse the seas, the spirit that rotates the world, the cause that translocates the sun from shining east to watery west. He sought the reason why spring hours are mild with flowers manifest, and who enriched with swelling grapes ripe autumn at the full of year. Now we see that mind that searched and made, all nature's hidden secrets clear, lie prostrate prisoner of night. His neck bends low in shackles thrust, and he is forced beneath the weight to contemplate the lowly dust. So once again, we see that he was once connected deeply to the processes and sources and directors of nature. But now he is caught in the illusion of the material world, the darkness of night, night being a common symbolism for ignorance, which is always associated with the illusory state of being identified with the material rather than the truth of the inner light and the divine nature. He no longer looks up, trying to find the source of all of nature's amazing regularity and connection. Rather, his neck now bends low, and he is forced to contemplate the lowly dust of his material identity destroyed. The point that Lady Philosophy will make to him over the course of the entire work is the same we find in many of the world's great spiritual traditions. That is, that suffering is caused based on the degree to which one has forgotten the true nature, whether that be a soul or simply awareness itself, the subject that forgets that it is, in fact, that which experiences, not the contents of its experience. And we see how this idea, which is very much present in Platonic systems, Neoplatonism, Christianity, also connects to other famous Roman systems of thought like Stoicism, because philosophy is going to heal him with the truth. He needs to master his emotions, to really know himself. This, of course, is also the concept of gnosis from traditions like Gnosticism, or being born again from Christianity. As we start chapter 3, Lady Philosophy again brings us back to the idea of unity versus separation, and that pieces of the truth have been torn away from her garment and incorporated in all of the different sectarian worldviews that fight with each other. The implication here is that there must be a true philosophy, which is a unification of all of the others. It must be the capital T truth, the theory in language that maps onto the reality it describes every way. False philosophers and false worldviews, again, only have pieces of this one true worldview, but they are still lost in ignorance. They're not really initiates to the truth. Lady Philosophy says specifically, "As part of their plunder, they tried to carry me off, but I fought and struggled, and in the fight the robe was torn which I had woven with my own hands. They tore off little pieces from it and went away in the fond belief that they had obtained the whole of philosophy. The sight of traces of my clothing on them gained them the reputation among the ignorant of being my familiars, and as a result, many of them became corrupted by the ignorance of the uninitiated mob." So a couple of key things to pick out of that passage that seem like small details, but they say quite a lot. We see here that Lady Philosophy is, in fact, the logos of the Greek philosophy and of Christianity, because she wove her robe with her own hands. That is, the capital T truth is self-determinate. It made itself, just as the logos in Christianity, for instance, creates creation. So she is the system that organizes all of creation, that leads to everything, including the true theory, the true philosophy that describes that creation. And of course this makes perfect sense, because we could not perceive or think, or certainly describe reality with language, unless there was a shared structure between all of those capacities and reality itself. So both reality itself and our capacities to do those things must come from the same source. They must follow the same logos. The next thing to note is a little clue or a nod to the Hermetic philosophy. The term uninitiated mob appears. The idea of initiation, of course, is closely tied to Hermetic philosophy. We get our term hermetically sealed from Hermeticism. The idea is that there is an ancient tradition of knowledge passed down to initiates. There's a rumor that Plato himself was an initiate, and so perhaps it's not surprising that Boethius, who is heavily inspired by Plato, bears some similarities, either intentionally or not, to Hermeticism and the concept of initiation. We see this again also, however, in other spiritual traditions. with concepts like enlightenment, the church, the elect, those who achieve gnosis. It's not that this knowledge is exclusive or that by nature it is only for a select few. It's that most of the population is not initiated into it, nor are they ready for it. As Lady Philosophy says here, most of the population would rather follow the ignorant, who have pieces of the truth, and therefore seem to be close allies of philosophy, but have in fact abused philosophy and taken only the parts that work for them. Then we come to one of the most powerful passages in the book, in my opinion. She talks to him about others who have suffered, like Socrates and Zeno, Seneca. She says, "The sole cause of their tragic sufferings was their obvious and complete contempt of the pursuits of immoral men, which my teaching had instilled in them. It is hardly surprising if we are driven by the blasts of storms when our chief aim on this sea of life is to displease wicked men. And though their numbers are great, we can afford to despise them, because they have no one to lead them, and are carried along by ignorance only, which distracts them at random, first one way, then another. When their forces attack us in superior numbers, our general conducts a tactical withdrawal of his forces to a strong point, and they are left to encumber themselves with useless plunder. Safe from their furious activity on our ramparts above, we can smile at their efforts to collect all the most useless booty. Our citadel cannot fall to the assaults of folly." This is a passage that can lend quite a bit of strength in times of chaos. The point is that those who achieve higher consciousness, whether that be heaven or a state of enlightenment, whatever the particular spiritual system entails, are above the fray of the duality, polarity, and battles of the 3D material illusion. We see that even physical death is not really a concern for those who have achieved ascension or who can count themselves in the book of life. They can watch from their higher position like heaven, or the higher dimensions, again, depending on the system, because the soul experiences death differently than does the ego. The ego is worried about the extinguishment of its physical, earthly identity, but the soul, to an extent, already exists above that, and just has to remember that it is eternal, that it is higher. And so once one does this, they can conduct a tactical withdrawal to a strong point, and watch as the wicked, who are still caught in the illusion, fight amongst themselves for the material plunder, none of which is actually real in the grand scheme of spiritual reality. And then at the start of chapter 4, we get a little hint as to what that actually looks like in our interior life. There's a passage, "Let men compose themselves and live at peace, set haughty fate beneath their feet, and look unmoved on fortune good and bad, and keep unchanging countenance." The hallmark of this passage is again echoed in many spiritual traditions. It's the idea that it's all well and good to make a choice, that good supersedes bad. But to really achieve peace, one must transcend the duality and the polarity of even good and bad itself, even fortune and misfortune. The idea being that one side of that polarity contains the other by definition. For instance, true love with a capital T, unconditional divine love, contains within it the normal opposite of love, which is hate. Because unconditional love also loves hate unconditionally. So when one achieves what might be called Christ consciousness, one transcends every possible duality that the material plane has to offer. And of course, as we'll see later on, the material plane is marked by duality. As Charles Sanders Peirce says, a thing without an opposite, ipso facto, does not exist. We can think here of the image of Christ in between the two thieves on their crosses. One thief, of course, is penitent and righteous. The other thief is not. Recall that Christ does affirm the righteousness of one man. However, does he love either of them less? Of course not. Christ consciousness, unconditional love by definition, does not. There's also the symbolism of the fact that Christ's cross is seen as both in between the two thieves, but also taller or higher than the two thieves. Now, the obvious explanation there is, well, he's Christ. Of course he's higher than the two mortal humans on either side of him. But that's too modern and too literalist an interpretation for my liking. I prefer to think that Christ consciousness places one both at the center of dualities, like good and bad, but also above them, transcendent of them, such that it includes in a unity that is only accessible through the divine nature, both aspects of the duality. Of course, this is the nature of duality and polarity, to actually just be 2 degrees of the same class of thing. Hot and cold, for example, are both temperature. Heat is a higher degree of temperature, cold is a lower degree of temperature. Or you could say that cold is a lower degree of heat, and heat is a lower degree of cold. Lady Philosophy then says, "Why then are miserable men in awe when tyrants rage impotently? If first you rid yourself of hope and fear, you have disarmed the tyrant's wrath. But whosoever quakes in fear or hope, drifting and losing mastery, has cast away his shield, has left his place, and binds the chain with which he will be bound." Once again here we see 2 sides of a duality, hope and fear this time. The master collapses those 2 into unity, does not egoically identify with either hope or fear, and in doing so, they disarm the tyrant's greatest weapons of psychological fear. Because again, you have to remember that the physical plane was inferior to the mental or spiritual plane in ancient texts. We do quite the opposite nowadays in modernity and in a culture dominated by materialism and physicalist philosophies. But the idea here is that the true warfare happens within the psyche. It's a war for the soul, not necessarily just for the physical condition. So the way to stop a tyrant is not to hate them or succumb to anger or fear or despair, but rather to transcend all of those emotions. And remember, the soul's divine nature above the physical. This is what a master does. Of course, that is very difficult for the ego to swallow. After all, the ego is not bad. It's not evil. It's a survival tool. It helps us know, as the philosopher Bernardo Kastrup says, to which mouth to bring the spoon. It is very much focused on keeping our physical experience going. And so what follows is Boethius delivering some very egoic whining. Now I'm going to read this passage, and I want you to try to pick out for yourself all of the examples of duality. And remember, strong emotions are inherently dual, just as fear and hope are. He says, "Surely the severity of fortune's attack on me needs no further mention. It is self-evident. Look at the mere appearance of this place. Is it the library of my house, which you chose yourself as a place of sure repose, and where you so often used to sit with me, discussing all the topics of philosophy? Are my clothes the same, and my face the same, as when I used to probe the secrets of nature with you, and you used to describe the various paths of the planets with your stick, and relate human ethics and the whole of human life to the patterns of the celestial order? This, then, is how you reward your followers. And yet, it was no one but you who commended Plato's opinion that commonwealths would be blessed if they should be ruled by philosophers, or if their rulers should happen to have studied philosophy." We see again his sense of injustice, which of course has the dual of justice. We see his feeling of betrayal, the dual of trust. We see that he's again trying to recede into his past egoic identity for comfort. But there's something really nice about this passage where he continues on and on and on, complaining even beyond that little bit that I read. Specifically, I love how practical and everyday are the examples that he gives. This is a guy who tries to do good in his life, and yet he is still caught in the duality, because by identifying with good at all, and not bad, he necessarily creates a separation from others. Because for his ego to identify as good requires some other to be bad. And so as long as that identity is in place, he is unable to transcend the duality into the unity of the divine nature and the unconditional love of what I'll again call Christ consciousness. The nuance here is that it's not about being complacent or not resisting the bad. It's not that you give up your desire to see the good win. It's that your desire to unconditionally love those who are good and bad transcends your desire for one side to win, just as Christ affirmed the righteous thief, but still loved the unrighteous thief just as much. However, if all of that sounds abstract, this section that Boethius gives us brings it right down to the practical of how this has applied to his life and his current situation. In fact, he goes on like this for pretty much the rest of the duration of chapter 4. It's an extensive list of his grievances. And it's quite relatable to anybody who considers themselves good and witnesses the success of the bad in the material world of ignorance. But as Lady Philosophy says, why would a master be surprised that the wicked succeed in the ignorant illusion of the material? So we see that there's a progression of remembrance that the soul undergoes during an ascension process, and a lot of it is catalyzed by the dark night of the soul. There is the choice of good over evil, and thus the egoic identification with good, which primes the soul for the dark night of the soul and the ultimate ascension. But that ascension sees the soul transcend all the dualities of the material plane, and only then has it achieved remembrance of its true nature as the divine unity. Then it has gnosis. Then it has mastery. Then it can resume its identification with the divine nature and be born again, ascended back to the Father, even while still experiencing the material. The salvation that Boethius seeks here, based on the grievances that he gives in this chapter, is to transcend that duality, to fully give up his egoic identity, and for his soul to remember. And that is what Lady Philosophy is trying to do. That is the capital T, truth. In chapter 5, we see Lady Philosophy tell him as much. She says in a passage, "It is not simply a case of your having been banished far from your home. You have wandered away yourself. Or, if you prefer to be thought of as having been banished, it is you yourself that have been the instrument of it. No one else could ever have done it. For if you remember the country you came from, it is not governed by majority rule like Athens of old, but, if I may quote Homer, one is its lord, and one its king. And rather than having them banished, he prefers to have a large body of subjects. Submitting to his governance and obeying his law is freedom. You seem to have forgotten the oldest law of your community, that any man who has chosen to make his dwelling there has the sacred right never to be banished. So there can be no fear of exile for any man within its walls and moat. On the other hand, if anyone stops wanting to live there, he automatically stops deserving it." This is a point that the ego really hates. It is basically the idea that there are no victims, because you are in control and can master your internal state. And again, it's the internal state that matters more than the external perceptual experiences of what we call the physical, which, again, in a Platonic system, is often seen as illusory. God does not banish souls from heaven, she says. Rather, souls banish themselves by forgetting their own nature. That nature never changes. It's their nature. They are a spark of the divine. But as a spark of the divine, they have some of the creative power of the whole, and so they can create an illusory reality for themselves in which they are separate from God, forgetful of their nature, and caught in the material illusion of duality and polarity. And this is why she goes on to say, "It is not the sight of this place which gives me concern, but your own appearance, and it is not the walls of your library with their glass and ivory decoration that I am looking for, but the seat of your mind." Again, the battle for a soul's ascension is not on the battlefields of the physical, where wicked men often triumph. That is illusion. The wicked men walk away with useless plunder, as she said before. The real battle takes place in the mind? Can the soul remember its true nature and ascend out of the illusion? Another nuance here, by the way, when I say illusion, I don't mean that the physical world is fake. It's not necessarily ontologically real in the modern sense that physicalism, for instance, treats the physical order. It's real as experience. These perceptual experiences of duality provide an education or a prison, depending on how the soul looks at it, with the ultimate graduation, or day of freedom, being that the soul has been sufficiently motivated to learn its lessons, or to remove the prison bars it placed over itself, and remembers its true divine identity. That is the name of the game that is the material illusion. And so no amount of wicked men's success gathering useless plunder really matters in the end, as long as the soul ascends and becomes a master of itself through knowledge of itself, which is really the same thing as saying knowledge of God. Because to remember that it is a spark of the divine, of course, the soul must also remember the divine unity as a whole. We get into chapter 6, and this one is much more of a dialogue rather than philosophy and Boethius trading monologues. She says, "Do you know the source from which all things come?" "Yes," I, Boethius, replied, and said that it was God. "How can it be, then, that you know the beginning of things but don't know their end? The peculiarity of these disturbances is that they have just enough power to move a man from his usual position, but can't quite throw him over and totally uproot him. I want you to answer this too. Do you remember that you are a man?" "Why shouldn't I?" said. "Can you then tell me what man is?" "Are you asking me if I know whether man is a rational and mortal animal? I do know it, and I acknowledge that that is what I am." "Are you sure you are not something more?" "Quite sure. Now I know the other cause, or rather the major cause of your illness. You have forgotten your true nature." So here we have Lady Philosophy explicitly saying what we have been talking about this whole time. We get an interesting mention of the beginning and the end. Here is another duality that God collapses into himself as the source of both the beginning and the end, a demonstration of what we've been talking about. We then dive into the specific false identity of the ego, where Boethius has come to identify as a man, a rational and mortal animal. And when asked if he is not something more, he denies that he is anything more. This is exactly the trap of the material illusion for the soul. The soul forgets that they are, let's say, the player playing the video game, and not the avatar character in the video game. It becomes too easy to get immersed in the story, to advance materially with wealth, gain more funds, gain more power, gain more abilities, just like in a game. And the player forgets that they are, in fact, the player. We see Boethius in this same trap. Again, a very Platonic idea like the allegory of the cave. Lady Philosophy goes on to give us a mechanism by which this illusion is created and maintained by the mind. She says, "As it is not yet time for stronger medicine, and as it is the accepted opinion that the nature of the mind is such that for every true belief it rejects, it assumes a false one from which the fog of distraction rises, to blot out its true insight, I will try to lessen this particular fog little by little." In other words, it is these false limiting beliefs that the egoic mind assumes when it forgets its true nature that traps the soul in the illusion until the soul can transcend even the mind that it experiences. We see this especially in Eastern philosophic traditions, where the idea is to remember that you are the subject having thoughts, having memories, having beliefs, having emotions, all of which come and go, and all of which object to the subject. In other words, because they're changeable, they cannot be your true nature. And so the spiritual path in Christianity, in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, essentially is a universal way for the soul to remember its true nature by ceasing its identification with the objects of its experience, and instead remembering that it is a spark of the divine, the experiencer. In chapter 7, we get more explicit discussion of this, with the lines, "If you desire to look on truth and follow the path with unswerving course, rid yourself of joy and fear, put hope to flight and banish grief. The mind is clouded and bound in chains where these hold sway." So again, the idea that to ascend, to hope to flight, one must transcend dualities like joy and fear, and in so doing, one cuts the ego's attachments and thus becomes free from grief, even when experiencing pain, loss, or material hardship. And so there, at the end of Book 1, we have seen the major themes of duality, polarity. We've introduced the concept of fortune and misfortune, which we will go into more deeply in Book 2. And Boethius has given his long list of grievances, and Lady Philosophy has hinted that she will introduce an increasing degree of intensity in the treatment that she prescribes for her patient here. Interesting, again, that it's described in medical terms, which to our modern minds would seem to relate to the physical, but she is really tending to his mind and to his soul here. So again, as we go through this book and any other classical or ancient text, keep in mind that the mental supersedes the material. And in fact, in the Platonic system, you could argue that the mental contains the material, because the material is the illusion experienced by the soul. I hope you see how this book is a beacon of hope in times of strife, times of turmoil, in our day and age when there is much duality, much polarization, much conflict. It is hard sometimes to disidentify with all of that, get out of our egos, and realize the unconditional love personified by Christ. I also know that there are probably people in the audience from many different spiritual traditions. I'm not here to endorse any particular one. I'm interested in all of them, and I'm going to refrain from sharing my own worldviews just yet. But I hope you can see the connections between them. I hope that you can see how the human condition, and really the soul's relation to itself, to reality, and to others, is expressed in pretty common themes throughout all of these. And the Consolation of Philosophy is one of the greatest examples of how all of these traditions converge and can be brought together very empathetically and very powerfully for us to practically apply to our lives. So I hope you enjoyed Book 1. We will continue next time with Book 2. Thanks for joining me, and keep your soul rising until we meet again. Bye-bye.